Okay, we are now reconvened in open session. We will consider action on closed session items. First up, Mrs. James.
Thank you, Mrs. Tossan. I move to appoint Anitra Senegal to the position of Instructional Officer for the Early Literacy Center.
Can I get a second? We have a motion by Mrs. James and a second by Mr. George. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes. Mr. Burdine.
Yes, Madam President. I move to appoint Carlo Leyva to the position of Principal for E.A. Jones Elementary School.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. Burdine and a second by Mrs. James. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes. Ms. Helliger.
I move to appoint Tasha Hamilton to the position of Principal for Missouri City Middle School.
We have a motion by Ms. Helliger and a second by Mr. George. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Did everybody vote? Motion passes. Mr. Rosenthal. You're not on.
I move to appoint Terrence Hayden to the position of Principal for Willow Ridge High School.
We have a motion by Mr. Rosenthal and a second by Mrs. James. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes. Mr. George.
Yes, Madam President. I move to appoint Glenda Johnson to the position of Executive Director of Talent Experience.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. George and a second by Mrs. James. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes. Mrs. James.
I move to appoint Kelly Keegan to the position of Director of Extended Learning. Second.
We have a motion by Mrs. James and a second by Mr. George. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. You gotta vote. Motion passes. Mr. George.
Yes. Motion language, level 3 appeal, DGBA local Doris Henderson. If the board chooses to designate a hearing officer to hear the level 3 appeal, I move that the Board of Trustees assign the level 3 employee grievance appeal of Doris Henderson to Richard Hightower, who will serve as the board's designated hearing officer under board policy DGBA local.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. George and a second by Mrs. James. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes. Mr. George?
So do I do this together or?
Two separate?
Separate, okay. Non-renewal rescission. I move the Board of Trustees propose the non-renewal of the term employment contract of Pedro Duran Acosta and rescind the term employment contract awarded to Pedro Duran Acosta for the 2018-19 school year, and to delegate to the superintendent authority to provide notice to Pedro Duran Acosta of the board's action.
We have a motion by Mr. George and a second by Mrs. James. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes. Mr. George.
Yeah, I move the Board of Trustees terminate Orikos Osamel probationary employment contract in the best interest of the district and to rescind the probationary employment contract awarded to Orikos Osamil for the 2018-19 school year, and to delegate to the superintendent authority to provide notice to Orikos Osamil of the board's decision.
We have a motion by Mr. George and a second by Mrs. James. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Why is it popping up randomly instead of all together? Motion passes. Mr. Burdine.
Yes, Madam President. I move to appoint Elizabeth Strotbeck to the position of Director of Child Nutrition.
We have a motion by Mr. Burdine and a second by Mrs. James. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes. Mr. Burdine.
Yes, Madam President. I move the Board of Trustees rescind the proposed non-renewal of Tatanisha Parker's term employment contract and approve the resignation and release agreement between Tatanisha Parker and Fort Bend ISD, and to delegate to the superintendent authority to execute the agreement and to provide notice to Tatanisha Parker of the board's action.
We have a motion by Mr. Burdine and a second by Mr. George. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes. Ms. Helliger.
I move the Board of Trustees delegate authorities to the superintendent to appoint and approve contracts of employment for campus administrators below the level of principal for the 2018-19 school year, and further move that this delegation of authority expire on August 31st, 2018.
We have a motion by Ms. Helliger and a second by Mrs. James. Do we have discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes. Next up is our activity report. Ms. Helliger.
I probably should start off this one saying that we've spent countless hours working on this facility master plan. But the board, for this activity report, we have Child Nutrition Manager graduation, Chamber Education Division TA Commissioner Mike Morath, Brass to Brass weekly meeting, spring sign-in day, compressed natural gas fuel station, safety advisory committee meeting, teacher of the year banquet, varsity softball games, session 4 leadership TASB, investment in youth luncheon, board self-evaluation, GCAASB spring workshop, state of the city, Missouri City, policy committee meeting, CTE center site visit, softball playoff games, Elkin Senior Award ceremonies, and I think we've also did the 30, 40, 50, 45 year appreciation.
Staff Service Awards.
Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Helliger. All right, the moment you've all been waiting for. We're going to consider action on the facilities master plan. I'm going to propose that we take them recommendation by recommendation. Recommendation 1, with regard to the Austin, Travis, and Bush feeder patterns, are to expand capacity from 850 to 1,000 at Elementary 51 during the construction process, build an addition at Neal Elementary for approximately 260 students, to increase the capacity from 850 to 1110, and build an addition at Madden Elementary for approximately 220 students to increase the capacity from 850 to 1070. May I have a motion? Or we can have a motion and then do discussion.
Yeah, I move that we accept recommendation 1 as written.
Presented.
Second.
We have a motion by Ms. Helliger and a second by Mrs. James. Do we have discussion? Mr. Rosenthal.
Since it was about, 6 hours ago when we started this, 5 hours ago.
6.
Well, but we didn't, we had recognitions and stuff beforehand, so anyway.
What's your question?
5.5 hours.
This was not one where we thought we wanted to add any more capacity, right? I just want to make sure so we don't have to go back.
No, I think,
Remember the discussion? Scott? Tammy, you remember? Okay, great. Okay, so we're good on the numbers? Okay.
any other, Mr. Rice?
Yes. Mr. Perez, does Madden Elementary School already have a core capacity for 1,000? As I recall, that was the school, was at 46, and it had been in the drawer for several years, so I don't know if that got increased to 1,000.
Yes, sir. No, that did not get increased to 1,000, but we have looked at it based on the portables that are there, and it can support it. It can support the 10.
So you're not recommending that we increase the core to 1,000 on Madden?
No, that is correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Any other questions or discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Recommendation 1 as written passes. Yeah, so recommendation 2 was an either or recommendation. Just to remind everyone, it was either build a school for approximately 850 students with a core size for 1,000 pending availability of a viable site at a feasible price, or to construct additions to Commonwealth Elementary School, Austin Parkway Elementary School, and Settlers Way Elementary School, and rezone to balance. May I have a motion?
Madam President, I move to accept the recommendation number 2. I don't know if I want to make an original motion or amend this motion.
Okay. You can.
Mr. Morris, can I make an original motion?
You will be making the original motion.
That's correct.
I'm making an original motion to accept recommendation number 2, which includes finding a new site for a new school in Riverstone to relieve Commonwealth, and, or if not possible, adding a 12 classroom addition at Commonwealth at Austin Parkway and a 10 classroom addition at Settlers Way, and to increase the common areas to accept the additional students.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. Rice and a second by Mrs. James. Do we have discussion? Mrs. James.
My question is, how will we know which of these paths we're taking, and can we get some data, I guess, information on the cost of these core expansions? Or, yeah, because I think we have estimates for the classroom additions. It's the cores we don't know.
Mr. Perez.
Yes, ma'am. We are actively pursuing property, so we would know that fairly quickly if it's going to be available or not be available. We would bring that back to you in closed session. And also, we're already working on getting that cost. We should have that fairly quickly to be able to let you know what the cost is of, what schools have to have a core expansion, how extensive, because all of them actually have it, but the extent of it, and then we could come up with a budgetary cost.
Do we think you would have that by June?
Yes.
Okay, so we think we will have an answer in June about whether or not there's property and what the cost would be if we have to go the route of the additions.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, Mr. Rosenthal.
So then we're going to basically approve or vote to approve or not approve this general recommendation. And it sounds like it's going to come back to us again to approve costs.
Well,
No,
I was actually going to interject on that. I think that the natural way this would come back to you, because remember, we're building the bond program as soon as you take any action. So there would be extensive discussion among staff to get the budget built for the bond program while we're looking for the property. So you would come back to you in a very timely manner about the property, and then immediately following with any bond discussion about what the budget would be for these additions, if that's the way we need to go. So it'll be back on the board's radar very soon, within the next 4 to 6 weeks, with a clear recommendation for direction.
So, but this thing says we're gonna look to see if land can be procured by August. So, are you saying that within a few weeks, when it comes back, or whatever it is in June, when it comes back, as out of the budget committee, or the bond committee, or whatever, that's when we're gonna know there's land or there's not land? Or can we keep that search going on, hoping that something comes up? What about if that decision gets made and some landowner decides for whatever reason in July or August or whatever that they're going to put their land up for sale and it's reasonable and it's something we can use? Or are we kind of, stopping the process without exhausting?
Well, we've been looking for about the last month, and we've discussed that with the board. So certainly if something comes up in July or August, it would be within the planning horizon to make an adjustment to the bond before. I think we're good on any adjustments until the board actually approves the final bond package, when that would be in August. So, it's not inconceivable.
Okay, so, all right. Because we can always, if we still think there's a shot that we find land, I guess you can always put the cost of building the school into the bond, and it'd be excess. But again, the way we've been doing stuff is we don't issue debt until we need the money. Mm-hmm. So it's that might be okay.
I don't know if I'd recommend including the price of a school on a contingency basis like that, though. That would be $30-40 million.
Yeah, but each one of these additions is going to be $5 million, so it's not that much more. It's anyway. All right. Well, you kind of see where I'm going with that. I don't want to. That obviously the first option there is the preferred solution, I think, for everybody. So I don't want to give up on it just because we ran out of time. So we're just going to go to option 2. So
Vote to contest.
Mrs. James?
I agree with Mr. Rosenthal. I don't think we should give up on that option, and I don't think we should put a deadline so much on that option have the deadline come too quickly. And I also agree with, I think, what Mr. Rosenthal was getting at. By the time we plan for these 3 additions and whatever core expansion, we're getting very close to the cost of an elementary school. So since it's an either-or situation, again, I don't know exactly the cost, but it might be that it comes kind of close.
Well, that's, I guess, the natural solution. That if you want us to budget for the elementary school, so we've got it, and then we can keep looking for land. But then if we end up needing to do the additions, then we just take apart that budget and parse it out over 3 schools. So that's
right. So we know we're in ahead of time. We may be inflating the bond by $15 million. Mm-hmm. But we know why we're doing it. It's not because we just want to inflate bonds. We're trying to hold on to that option and hope that we find the land. So I guess the other question is, we talked about when these additions would go in. Is that something we want to put into the resolution, or do we want to, or the recommendation, or do we want to leave that open?
Well, the recommendation is written with specific dates. I was going to suggest that the board would modify to increase those dates.
I'm going to recommend that we vote on this motion, and then maybe we have a second motion that, that clarifies the dates, our expectation of when these additions would be made. And that way we can vote on we can vote. So are the dates, well, so that's the point of clarification, because we have a timeline that's attached to the recommendation. And I assume we're going to be approving that timeline that's attached to the recommendation.
Well, Madam Board President, another option, given what the superintendent has shared about the possibility of finding land within the next 30 days, is simply to postpone this item until your June board meeting, where you're not making a motion that has an alternative, that you're not really certain about what the alternative will be or the dates. It may resolve itself within that 30-minute period.
The only thing that concerns me about that is that I would like for the community to have some certainty around what the board's expectation is. I mean, you guys can weigh in on it, but I don't mind the administration coming back and telling us we haven't found land, or like Dave and Grail say, we can even extend that search over the next several months. But I think in order to give the community some certainty about the board's expectations, I would recommend that we vote on this tonight. And if we need to modify the dates that are in the timeline attached to the recommendation, which is the alternative recommendation, then we just do that.
Can I say something?
Yeah, Mrs. James.
I would agree with that, Mrs. Tossan. I think we should vote on the recommendations. And one of the things that I had thought about earlier is that maybe after we vote on these recommendations tonight, the administration needs to kind of run them all to ground and overlap them with the timelines to make sure the numbers all work out. We've heard some discussion that maybe there's some data changes, there's been typos, maybe mistakes, I don't know. But I guess I would like to have a certain level of confidence in that as we layer these things one on top of the other, it's actually a feasible plan to execute, especially when we're talking about large numbers of construction projects. So that would kind of be my thought, that we'd let the administration recommend the timing more than we're recommending the priorities of the projects.
So do we scratch the, no, sorry.
Mr. Rosenthal's okay.
No, she had her.
Oh, Ms. Helliger.
We're all delirious. I just want to make sure I understand the motion. Is the motion basically, Jim, just a summary of this particular recommendation that they have listed here? I just want to make sure, because what I'm trying to do is, as we're going through this, is making sure that I vote based on some of the sentiments of the community as well, with the recommendations from the Facilities Master Plan Committee. And so you're stating that it is what it is.
So the motion was to approve recommendation 2, to find to search for the land and build the elementary school. And if no land is found, then to add these additions. It's as laid out here in the recommendation.
Well, I'd like to amend my motion. And I'm now making a motion to amend my original motion because of all the discussion about the date, and to remove the deadline of August 2018 for the procurement of land. Because what's magic about finding land by August 2018? Well, then take it out. So that's my motion.
All right. Do we have a second?
Second.
So we have a motion by Mr. Rice and a second by Mr. Rosenthal. Do we have discussion on the amendment to remove the August 2018 deadline?
I think it's a good idea.
Okay, let's vote on the amendment, please. All right, the amendment passes. So now we need to vote on the original motion, which is to adopt the recommendation without the August 2018 deadline.
So I still, go ahead.
I had a discussion. I just wanted to make sure I understood where this elementary school came from, because I'm looking at the facilities master's plan committee recommendations, and that wasn't one of the recommendations. I just want to verify and understand where that came from.
It wasn't on there.
Yeah, it's not.
When we were going through the planning process, we were under the understanding that there was no land available in the area. And so there was not much committee time discussed on it.
And then some of us got hit with emails about the fact that there was available land. So we brought it up to Scott, and it ended up as a recommendation.
So there was no land when you all initially went through it, and now we're putting it on as a recommendation to vote on? Okay. So, well, okay.
So I still want to clarify. So we're voting on this. We removed the deadline. Do the timelines for the additions still apply to this recommendation?
On the second piece of it, yes. So we can, if Mr. Rice would be willing, we could further amend the original motion to get rid of the timeline for the additions as well, and that can be brought back to us at a later date.
I'll make a motion.
Well, let's see what he says. Are you willing to have the original? Would you like to?
Well,
I can put it down.
You can, yes.
yes, I'll amend the original motion to remove those dates.
Second.
All right, we have an amended motion to remove the specific dates set forth on the additions and recommendation 2. We have a motion by Mr. Rice and a second by Mrs. James. Do we have discussion on this one?
Yeah. I have a question.
Ms. Helliger.
Maybe I missed it. So if we remove the dates for both of these areas, what are we waiting on? When do we actually take action? What would be the process? Now we have no dates. We don't have a timeline.
Bond,
Okay.
design, and the timing as to when these things are needed. I mean, I think we all talked when this came up 5.5 hours ago, that we'd like to see those things moved up rather than wait until it hits 120% for on one of them, move it up a year or two so it doesn't hit that.
Well, thank you for reminding me. I've slept somewhat since then.
It's been,
I've tried at least.
like I said.
So thank you for clearing that up. So we're going to wait and see based on the bond. And then based on that, so our action today, if we vote this a yes, then which one takes effect based on whichever we find land first, or we don't, then we would do the additions. Okay. All right.
Mr. Rice.
Well, I was just going to clarify, we've got to vote to call an election in November, 72 days prior to election date, which in practical terms means we'll be voting in August if the administration proposes it. So between now, I guess today is the 15th. The administration has got 2.5 months, to come back to us with a recommendation, and then they'll know. But in the meantime, please find the land.
Yes. Thank you. Anybody else? Please. Yes, let's first vote on the amendment. Please vote. The amendment passes. We're now voting on the original motion as amended by removing the August 2018 date and the other dates and the additions. Please vote. Motion passes. All right, recommendation number 3 is an OR recommendation. build additions at Fort Settlement Middle School or build additions at First Colony Middle School. Someone like to make a motion?
Madam President, I'll make an original motion to build a 12 classroom addition at Fort Settlement and build a 12 classroom addition at First Colony Middle School.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. Rice and a second by Mr. George. Do we have discussion on this recommendation?
Yes.
Ms. Helliger?
Just weighing it again with the committee. So one of the things that we didn't talk about earlier was that we talked about putting the addition on either or, but the committee, based on their recommendation, stated they wanted to rezone to balance enrollment with Fort Settlement. They had an overwhelming,
I think you can't rezone without the addition.
We're putting the addition in.
You got to put the addition in order to rezone because there's not capacity.
Right, so
So but when we talked earlier, we did talk about rezoning, but it was later on, so.
Depends on where you put the addition. So there's, I think, well,
So if you notice the emails that we were getting slammed with that said support Fort Settlement Edition, but not First Colony Edition, that's because they know that if there's a addition at First Colony, there's a good chance they'll be rezoning. So they don't want that. So that's why we when we originally discussed this, I mean, Mr. Rice just made the motion and scratching or and putting and, whereas the original recommendation was or. So, okay.
that's the motion.
Okay.
It's an and.
Do we have additional discussion?
Yes. So since that recommendation has been changed, I think we should discuss that before.
Have at it.
So by doing that, I mean, you're basically saying that we're going to commit funds to add the First Colony, and the only rational outcome that can come out of that is rezoning Fort Settlement, somebody in Riverstone into First Colony Middle School.
Not necessarily.
That's not true.
Okay, so
We're going
why?
to need the capacity.
Well, I mean, if you look at First Colony, it's going down, down, down. So I don't think we need that capacity. I mean, I think it settles in it. Don't remember the numbers, but it's they're on here.
I have a question.
It settles in at 82%.
I have a question.
Mrs. James.
So I don't think that's necessary.
Mrs. James.
I have a question. This is a question for you, Mr. Leopold. On the piece of paper that I have on slide 9 from your presentation, it shows First Colony enrollment this year at 1,274 students, and it shows next year at 923.
Sienna moves out.
Sienna moves out.
Right.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
Baines.
So those are kids that are going
Back to Baines.
back to Baines, where some of the Baines is going to Thornton.
That's correct.
Okay. So that's what that means. Okay, thank you.
So with that in mind, do we still want to use the term "and" here? Because I think if we do that,
So if we put it at Fort Settlement, we don't need the extra capacity at First Colony?
That's correct.
Okay. Well, I'll be happy to withdraw my motion with unanimous consent.
Do we have consent of the trustees? We don't need, do we need to technically vote on that? No.
Hold on. What is the logic?
Turn
What
your
is the
microphone
logic why we are withdrawing that motion?
I withdraw it.
Can't you withdraw it? Because we don't need both additions.
Okay.
Mr. Leopold, and the data shows that enrollment is going down at First Colony and utilization is going down at First Colony.
Okay.
So we don't need 2 additions.
Right. But
Okay.
We could still keep the original.
So I need a motion.
Motion to approve recommendation 3 as presented.
No, okay. We have a motion by Mr. Rosenthal and a second by Mr. George. Do we have discussion?
Yes.
It's,
I would like to amend your motion, Mr. Rosenthal, to build a 12 classroom addition at Fort Settlement.
I second that. I second that.
we have a motion by Mr. Rice and a second by Mr. George to amend the original motion to build the addition on Fort Settlement. And not for, yeah, guys, y'all can't talk. Sorry. To build the addition on Fort Settlement and not the addition on First Colony. Is that correct, Mr. Rice?
Yes.
Do we have discussion on the amendment?
I second that, first of all. I don't know. I didn't hear a second.
seconded.
Has it? Okay. It's been, what, 5 and 7 hours?
I second it, right?
Yes.
I thought I seconded.
Do we have discussion on it?
I would agree to that. I think
Okay,
that's,
then
that's the way
let's
it should
vote on
be
the
said.
amendment to amend the original motion. Motion passes. Sapna can't speak out in the, okay. Okay, so we just voted to approve the amendment, so the motion on the table is to build the addition on Fort Settlement Middle School and not First Colony. Do we have discussion on that motion? Ms. Helliger?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, the reason why that's now the recommendation based on the numbers. We're running something right now, but we're running,
That's right, yeah.
yeah,
straight.
based on,
Next page.
next page?
No, on
Yeah,
your,
sorry, I got so many pages up here. But based on the just clearly based on the utilization. If we build it at First Colony, we're still at overcapacity, right? At Fort Settlement.
Yes.
yes,
We have to rezone.
And we would have to rezone.
yes.
And if we build it at
Fort
Fort
Settlement.
Settlement,
No reason.
no rezoning is needed. We just balance out the district.
Well, you're still a little bit of, I mean, you're above 100%, but,
You're within policy.
you know,
Mrs. James?
Okay, it looks to me, Ms. Helger has my papers, but it looks to me that the Facilities Master Plan Steering Committee recommended that the addition go on First Colony Middle School. And do we know why they suggested that rather than, do we know why they suggested that? End of sentence.
We didn't consider putting an addition on Fort Settlement. I think part of it is because we were looking at having the schools similar sized. And the other piece of it was that the Fort Settlement or the First Colony addition was actually a recommendation out of the 2014 master plan. And so that's kind of how that came into play.
Okay, so it wasn't considered by the Facilities Master Plan. And so if we build an addition on to Fort Settlement, what is suggested here, what's on the table is that the capacity would be up to 1,700 students. 1,699. Okay, that's pretty close to 1,700. What do we... Sorry. Is that a size, a middle school that we currently, do we have a middle school that size right now?
Baines is that size right now. It has that many kids there. I don't think the middle school accommodates them. To answer her question.
I'm sorry, I don't have that in front of me, but I'm pretty sure Beth has that spreadsheet.
hang on.
Well, I'm just asking, okay, I want to ask the instructional people, is this an instructional problem to have a middle school this size? Is it too big for a middle school, for managing a middle school? I guess that's my question.
Baines is 1554 capacity.
It falls within our range, a little over 100%, and it would be manageable. There's a number of different things that you could do for passing periods and things to stagger those pieces so that kids could, you could reduce the traffic in the hallways. You may have to float some teachers, or depending on the capacity and number of classrooms and the number of staff that you have to add. But it is a manageable situation that wouldn't be extremely cumbersome. May not be the best case scenario, but it's manageable.
Do we have any other? I need the audience not, please. Do we have other discussion?
So, yeah.
Ms. Helliger.
All right. So just to make sure that I'm giving this the full, exploration of what was talked about at the committee, is if we did the first colony, we have to rezone. Does the community are they willing to do the rezone?
Yes, the Riverstone people.
No, right.
Okay.
So okay. All right. Okay.
So I want to confirm that regardless of where we would do an addition, First Colony or Fort Settlement, we would have to increase the core. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Mr. George.
Yeah, a couple of other considerations I thought about was, one is both facilities need money spent on core. That is one. And also another, I mentioned before, Fort Settlement is a newer building, and First Colony is an older building. So you're adding a new construction to it. I thought it make more sense to add to a new structure. And also being, I don't have anybody in Fort Settlement, but I know I talked to numerous people from the community. Their T-shirt says there is no more rezone. So I support that because they have been bounced around so many times. That's the reason why I thought it is, as far as I'm concerned, a logical thing to do a Fort Settlement. That's why I asked, is that possible? And they said it is. So that's why I thought it is a logical thing to do. Thank you.
Okay. Please vote.
We're voting on which one?
Voting on the motion to expand Fort Settlement. Motion passes. Next up is recommendation 4, which is to rebuild Meadows Elementary School for approximately 450 students and to rebuild Lakeview for approximately 450 students. I want to remind the board members that this included a future repurposing of Barrington Place Elementary. So I'd like to have a motion, please.
President.
You're going to make a motion? Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
So I actually would like to separate this out and deal with this separately. So I make a motion to rebuild Meadows Elementary School for approximately 450 students, period. Second.
We have a motion by Ms. Helliger and a second by Mrs. James. Do we have discussion? You have something? Mr. Rosenthal?
I'm just curious. Just curious. I'm okay with it, but I'm just curious because that's the easy one. I don't, why do you want to separate it out? Just to simplify it?
Well, a couple things. I think we need to have a conversation because it says it wraps around Barrington Place as we purposed in Barrington Place for 5 years, and I don't want to do that.
Right,
So I'm trying to take it out, deal with Meadows Elementary School by itself. We can deal with Lakeview and Barrington by itself. That was my recommendation in my mind.
I'm okay with it.
All right, please vote. Motion passes. May I have another motion, please?
Yeah, I have a motion to rebuild Lakeview Elementary School for approximately 450 students capacity with a core size for 600 on existing sites.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. George and a second by Mr. Rice. Do we have discussion? Mr. Rosenthal?
Yes. I would like us to consider an amendment on that. And then amendment would be to, 1, in this order, renovate and add a 12 classroom addition to Sugar Mill Elementary. 2 would be to renovate Town West Elementary. 3 would be rebuild Lakeview Elementary. And continue to use Barrington Place Elementary as the elementary school that it is currently designed for and being used for.
Do we have a second? We have a motion by Mr. Rosenthal to amend the original motion and a second by Mr. Rice. Do we have discussion?
Yes.
Mr. Rosenthal?
So, listening to our discussion 5.5 hours ago, Ms. James, you brought up a really good point that I hadn't really considered. And that was, if we were to rebuild, and again, I'm not against rebuilding Lakeview. It was just a matter of the order, okay? But if we build that, I think you're right. I think you will regenerate that neighborhood much more quickly. And I know as far as the addition to Sugar Mill, that was one of the recommendations from the steering committee. And since you're already doing, Oscar, correct me if I'm wrong, you're already going to be in at Sugar Mill doing a whole bunch of renovations, right? I mean, that's got an FCI of like 57% or something. So that sounds like some major work's going to be going on.
That is correct.
So to me, while you're there, while we have those students swinging the Barrington for a year, build the additions. Okay, it's not, you don't have a special, mob, demob charges for all the construction crews because they're all going to be there, right? So, and then you're creating additional capacity for the future. If we want to start doing pre-K programs and something else, it's a brand new addition. So while you have the chance, it's not that much money, increase the capacity.
Mrs. James?
Well, Mr. Rosenthal, I disagree with your recommendation because the suggestion that we have is to build Lakeview at 450 with a core to support 600. So if we need additional space for pre-K or whatever it might be, we have that option. The 10-year projections don't project us needing additional space if we move some of the students out of or realign the feeder patterns with some of those students. I believe that Lakeview Elementary School has waited a very long time to be renovated. It has been passed up the entire time that I've been on the school board, and I think it's deserving of getting the renovations and bringing the school up to standard that the rest of the schools in this district have. So I'm against this amendment.
I'd like Mr. Rice.
Well, Mr. Rosenthal, did I misunderstand your motion? I thought you included, didn't you include?
Yes.
You included Lakeview to rebuild it. So why are you against it, Mrs. James?
I'm against it because he said that, well, he's added a number of things in his commentary, but basically building additions to Sugar Mill Elementary before doing any renovation to Lakeview Elementary. And that's why I'm against it, because I think that Lakeview Elementary should be first in line to be renovated. As I mentioned when we voted a couple of months ago not to put the security vestibule in at Lakeview Elementary. So we didn't vote that. It didn't come to us from the administration. because there wasn't enough money put in the last bond to get that work done. And so I asked administration to bring forward the solution to Lakeview, and there is not a solution until we can do a complete renovation.
Now, I heard you very loud and clear, and I heard you 2 months ago whenever you talked, but I did not hear. Mr. Rosenthal, did you recommend that we wait to renovate Lakeview? If you did, I guess I missed that.
No, I'm just suggesting that is the last thing that we do is actually not renovate, but actually rebuild. Okay, which is what we're talking about.
Point of clarification. So we're not making the decision tonight on the order that we're going to do things. I mean, I believe we're making the decision on how to address utilization, and that the order that we do things will be presented to us at a later time. That's my understanding. So
it could be whatever we want it to be.
Well, it can be.
But
I wouldn't recommend that we make those kinds of decisions tonight, because we don't have, as we all agreed earlier, we don't have the timeline laid out with the funding laid out and what needs to happen when. So I would suggest that we not try to make those decisions tonight, that we make decisions on how we're going to address the problem at hand, and that's utilization. So it was your amendment to put things in a particular order, or just to amend to add those items?
Okay, so somewhere it was written, it actually talked about in this under this recommendation, it actually talked about, I guess it was under the impacts, it talked about Sugar Mill and Town West. So if we don't want to include those, that's fine. I still think that we should put the addition on Sugar Mill.
So your amendment is to add to rebuilding Lakeview, to also put additions on Sugar Mill, and...
Well, the renovations are already...
well, renovations, but not additions.
Right.
You're saying you want additions to Sugar Mill, and what's the third thing?
That's it.
Leaving Barrington Place
as
zoned.
Right.
So that's the amendment on the table.
Okay, so...
Do we have additional discussion on that amendment? Do you have anything, Mr. Redding?
No, ma'am, I was confused a minute ago, but I think
okay. So the three things, the original amendment was to rebuild Lakeview. Mr. Rosenthal's amendment is to add to that additions to Sugar Mill and not repurposing Barrington Place, but leaving it as is. Mrs. James. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I like the idea of rebuilding Lakeview. I like the idea of not repurposing Barrington Place Elementary, but I'm opposed to.
Why do we?
So I would be against this amendment.
Why do we need additions to Sugar Mill? What does the utilization look like if we rebuild Lakeview, rebuild Meadows, and keep Barrington Place? Why do you think we need additions to Sugar Mill?
Well, I'm looking at the steering committee, and I guess it was a 12-12 split on, it says major renovation, but in the expected outcomes, it says in 14.3 million includes addition at Sugar Mill Elementary. And so, you know, we keep talking about.
Okay, let me get Mr.
Yes.
Leopold to just answer the question first.
I believe that steering committee option that they showed the support on did not have Lakeview online in that scenario.
So the additions to Sugar Mill would be needed if Lakeview is not rebuilt.
That's correct.
Okay.
So again, that's what I talked about earlier. So if you do that, you actually,
It's one or the other.
You don't need Lakeview.
Okay,
but,
so I'm
I
gonna-
know that there's
I'm gonna
not support for that, so.
Okay, I'm going to close discussion and ask us to vote on the amendment. And the amendment is to add to the original motion to rebuild Lakeview, to also add additions to Sugar Mill, and to not repurpose Barrington Place. Keep it as is. Vote on this motion. Motion fails, the amendment. So we're going back to the original motion, which is to rebuild Lakeview Elementary School for 450 students. Please vote on that original motion.
Wait. Because I think we need to include the piece about Barrington Place. That's not in the original
Or we
motion.
can make an additional motion after that.
Separate motion about Barrington Place.
Okay.
So a vote on the original motion. Motion passes. May I have an additional motion?
Yes, I move that we leave Barrington Place as is currently zoned.
We have a motion by Ms. Helliger and a second by Mr. George. Do we have discussion on this? Mrs. James?
I'm not sure if that's what she really meant to say. You meant to that you want it to not be repurposed.
Non-repurposed. Okay, I'll withdraw my motion and
Unanimous consent. Do we have unanimous consent?
Yes.
I'm glad. Thank you. I move that we. I'm too tired now. I don't even know what I'm saying.
Not repurpose Barrington Place.
Non-repurposed Barrington Place.
Second.
We have a motion by Ms. Helliger and a second by Mr. James. Do we have discussion on this motion?
You said Mr. James, but
I said Mrs. James. I just wasn't speaking into the microphone. Please vote.
You got the mistress.
Seriously. Motion passes. Okay, recommendation 5 is to construct a new elementary school for 850 students to relieve the Parks and Palmer Elementary School area and to go through a rezoning process. Do we have a motion for this one?
Yeah, I move to. Yes, I move to construct a new elementary school for approximately 850 students with a core size for 1,000 to relieve Parks Elementary and Palmer Elementary.
second.
We have a motion by Mr. George and a second by Mrs. James. Do we have discussion on this item?
Yeah, just quickly.
Ms. Helliger?
I don't think we need that part around to relieve Park Elementary School in Palmer in your motion because we're going to be doing rezoning and reconfiguration of that particular east side area.
Yeah, the only reason I said, otherwise it doesn't say where.
No.
Oh, you say recommendation 5?
Yeah, is your mic on?
Yes.
Okay.
So what do I need to do?
Nothing, unless you want to.
Well,
Mrs. James?
Ms. Helger, your point is well taken because this school could relieve other schools as well and they could be involved in the attendance boundary changes. But I think, as Mr. George said, this just draws attention to where this school would be and then the administration can figure out what to include.
Mr. Rosenthal?
And it does relieve Parks and Palmer. It may relieve additional schools as well, but it does do that, so.
Do we have additional discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes. Moving on to recommendation 6. This has to do with the Marshall feeder pattern and using innovative instructional programming. Mrs. James.
Well, I'd like to say that I made a note here. Recommendation 6 refers to Marshall. Recommendation 8 refers to Willow Ridge. Recommendation 9 refers to Ridge Point. And recommendation 10 refers to Marshall, Willow Ridge, and Hightower. And it occurs to me that all of those recommendations involve innovative programming, and they all use the same language for expanding choices and improving student outcomes. So it seems that we should maybe combine all of that into one motion or take all of those 4 together and ask for innovative programming. But I would like to be sure that we put some expectations around that and some checkpoints in terms of having a plan presented to us that gives us something to hang our hat on.
So perhaps this is one of the recommendations that, if the board agrees, should be put on hold until we get a better plan and get some more information from the administration. Would board members like to weigh in on that, Ms. Helliger?
Yes, I agree. I think it's just too ambiguous for us to vote on. So I make a motion that we pull.
You don't have to move anything.
Okay, good. All right, great.
We can just skip it.
Okay.
Mr. Rosenthal.
Yes, I agree. I think we need goals and timetables.
Mr. Burdine.
I agree with that as well.
Mr. George.
But what about there are a couple of elementary school that is, because also this whole purpose is to create our bond package, right? I thought it is, I was about to talk about recommendation 10, which doesn't have any financial impact on.
Well, now we're just saying to table
collectively?
6.
Okay.
No. Just table recommendation 6. That's what we're looking at right now. We'll go through them one by one.
Okay.
And asking the administration, and frankly, we need something in June. We need something in June.
Okay.
We need a plan around utilization at these schools and how we plan to address that. We need something set out a little more concrete, and so that the community knows and we know what we're voting on. Okay?
Right.
Okay. 7, Ridge Point.
Madam President, I move to accept recommendation 7 to construct a new elementary school for approximately 850 students to relieve elementary schools in the Ridge Point feeder pattern, and to construct a second new elementary school for approximately 850 students to relieve elementary schools in the Ridge Point feeder pattern.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. Rice and a second by Ms. Helliger. Do we have discussion on this item? Mr. Rosenthal.
Yes, I would like to offer an amendment that these schools be originally built to a capacity of 1,000 students.
I second it.
We have a motion by Mr. Rosenthal and a second by Mr. George. Do we have discussion on the amendment to build the elementary schools, both of them, for 1,000? Ms. Helliger, do you have discussion? Mrs. James.
What data do we have that supports that? Or doesn't?
It's already going to be over.
Yeah, it's going to be over fast.
In,
That's been 10 years.
right. Yeah.
So the utilization with the 2 new schools at 850 is 108% in 10 years. If we add another 500 to it, we'll be right at 100. The other thing I would want to add is that we don't have an addition on Leonetti. Leonetti is 850 with 1,000 core.
Is it cheaper for us to build for the 1,000 in the original construction than to come back and add?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Do we have additional discussion? All right, we're voting on the amendment to the original motion to build these schools originally for 1,000. Please vote. Motion passes. Now we're going to vote on the motion to build 2 elementary schools at 1,000 capacity. Do we have discussion? Please vote. Motion passes. All right, recommendation 8, similarly to recommendation 6, are for elementary schools in the Willow Ridge feeder pattern. Am I to understand from the board that we would like to do the same with recommendation 8 that we did with recommendation 6? We'd like to have that as part of your plan, please, ma'am. Please, sir. Okay. Recommendation 9 is the flexible scheduling at Ridge Point. Do we have a motion or discussion on this item? Mr. Burdine.
Is this something that we should pull and have more discussion about, or what are our thoughts on that?
Mr. George?
I agree with that because this doesn't tell me anything what we are really planning, because I like to have more information because that community is concerned about what it is. So we should clarify that. For that reason, I think we should table this.
So my suggestion, I agree with that. How quickly can you guys get it to us? Because here's my concern. We have no certainty in that area of what's going to happen with the kids attending Ridge Point and then the new homeowners coming in and buying. And as was stated earlier, which is happening, people are moving now to the back of Sienna because they think somehow they're safe from being rezoned. People are scrambling around there. So I think we have to give them some certainty pretty quickly. So if you guys are going to study this and bring us something, I mean, I would not only want to know what it's going to look like, but I want answers to the questions I posed earlier. Is this a long-term fix? How long is it going to fix it? Are we going to have to cap an overflow? Are we going to have to rezone anyway? Are we going to use the middle school to overflow? All of those questions have to be answered. How quickly can you get it to us?
Well, okay, so really we've answered most of those questions in terms of, yes, it's going to take implementation, which will require some type of overflow using either the middle school, either a cap and overflow, because we just are not going to be able to get something to scale that's going to have any kind of long-term difference within the next 3 to 4 years. So I think really the direction we need from the board is we're not going to be able to put together a plan by June that's going to satisfy the level of questions the board has or that the community has. So if we're unwilling to look out to October, November, December, as it currently states, then we need a clear direction about what you would like us to do if we believe we cannot wait that long to study it.
Mrs. James.
Well, I would like to make a motion then I thank you for sharing that. I'd like to make a motion to rebalance the attendance boundaries between Hightower High School and Ridge Point High School.
Second.
We have a motion by Mrs. James and a second by Ms. Helliger. Do we have discussion?
Yes.
Mr. Rosenthal.
Actually, I would like to amend that, if I may, and go back to the steering committee. I know, Ms. Tossan, you commented earlier you don't like this, but there was a suggestion. It was fairly positively received about building a 9th grade center. And I know I'm not a huge fan of that, but we got to solve a problem. And I think if you combine that with attendance boundaries, you have a much longer range.
So are you making a motion to amend to add a 9th grade
I would
center?
add a 9th grade center, and we do already have property down there, at least in that 521 area. I don't know if that's feasible.
Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. Rosenthal and a second by Mr. Rice. Do we have discussion on this? The reason I don't like the 9th grade center is because it only buys us 3 years. I don't know why we're investing capital dollars in a building that doesn't solve the problem.
By itself, it only solves, but I think if you combine it with...
So we're going to rezone and build a 9th grade center?
That's what the motion says.
Okay, yeah, no, I definitely don't agree with that. I think if we're going to rezone, then we can balance enrollment with all 4 grade levels. I think if we're pulling an entire grade out of a high school and then also rezoning within 3 years, that sounds like complete upheaval to me of the community.
Let's talk about it.
So I don't like that idea at all. I also have concerns around pulling the entire grade out, and not just with sports, but with, I can't even imagine having to bus the kids back for 7th period theater, and bus the kids back for 3rd period choir, and bus the kids back for 2nd period choir, and bus the kids back. I mean, there are kids who are in all of these top choirs that are mixed between grades and top theaters that are mixed between grades, and I just have a lot of concerns about that. And it doesn't solve the problem. If we're going to have to rezone anyway, then I don't know why we would pull an entire grade out of their high school.
Well, it means less rezoning.
Doesn't mean less rezoning.
Well, it does.
And the growth is going to be, I just don't think that it does.
So I guess a question for Scott would be, in order to, if you just went with the rezoning, how many people need to be rezoned out of Ridge Point? They can't all fit in the high tower. We've already played those numbers before.
It would be a domino rezone.
If I go from memory, we'd have to displace over 1,700 kids out of Ridge Point to keep Ridge Point at 100% by year 10.
So, again, I understand your concerns about the ninth grade center, but at some point, I think we stated that there's going to be 4,000 kids at Ridge Point.
4,370.
Okay, so if you remove one grade level, that's 1,000. Is it possible to rezone 700 kids into high tower, not overcrowd high tower?
And are you talking about rezoning only sophomores, juniors, and seniors, and not freshmen? I mean, I don't even know how that works.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So so my other question would be, we talked about this. If we implemented some form of flexible scheduling that's not as robust as was discussed earlier, and either cap and overflow or rezone, how many kids are we looking at needing? We talked about these numbers. How many kids are we looking at needing to rezone with a more of a phase in? Maybe only seniors doing some flexible scheduling, or only seniors and juniors doing some flexible scheduling.
I believe it was up to 1,200 in year 5 that we would need to look at displacing.
Okay. Do we have additional discussion on this amendment? Mr. George?
Yeah, amendment Mr. Rosenthal just made.
Yes, to also construct a ninth grade center.
I
And
agree with you,
rezone.
and I don't know, it doesn't make, overall, everything what we are talking.
Yeah.
Kind of, I really don't know, honestly.
So I would actually like to withdraw that, because I do think it warrants more discussion, and I don't think at 1 o'clock in the morning, we should be making these decisions right now without some more work with Scott and.
Okay, we have unanimous consent on the withdrawal of the motion. Okay. So we're back to the original motion to rezone Ridge Point. Mrs. James.
Yeah, I don't, So, Mr. Leopold, when I'm looking at this page that has high school capacity enrollment and utilization on it, and if I take the high tower numbers starting 2019 and average what we've got for high tower and Ridge Point, and it looks like that works out for maybe 4 years. So by then, perhaps we could have our innovative schedule or whatever put together. Maybe we'll have it in October, or whatever we said. But, okay, am I reading the graph correctly?
Yes, but I just want to point out that the projected enrollment beyond 18-19 does not include any academy enrollment in Hightower. And so the students, I believe there's about 330 students coming into Hightower from outside the zone. So
Right.
If the academy program stays at its current level, you'd add an extra 330 to Hightower.
So if we vote to rezone the Ridge Point kids, with no other programming, are we effectively voting to rezone also Hightower kids?
I believe per policy programs are portable.
Oh, so we're voting to need to move an academy to make space, or to rezone kids to make space.
Yeah, that's right.
Correct.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So I will say,
Well,
I want to say that I don't think, I don't know what the long-term solutions are, guys, because we're not, I was going to make an amendment to make sure that we include land into this for a high school. But a high school is not going to happen in this bond because it's not needed in this bond. So I do think we need to have the land for long-term planning. But the bottom line is I do not believe I can vote to just solve this problem by rezoning without looking at programming. So I'm just gonna say that. I don't think we should do that. I don't feel like that's that's the solution by itself. So I'm not gonna muddy this motion right now with the to amend and put the land in it. I'll make that motion separately, but I'm just going to say that I think we need land for future planning, and I don't think we should do this without considering programming to prevent the massive rezoning that's going to take place. I know that the steering committee, who I think we have a couple of members that are sticking it out, and you guys recommended the domino rezoning and the massive, and and I know why. I understand why, but I feel like we have to give the opportunity at Marshall and Willow Ridge for some of these early college things that could really help our students, and maybe some academy programs that could really help our students. So just going to put that out there. That's my thought process, and I just really don't feel like I can vote for rezoning without programming. Mr. George.
I just wanted to, I agree with Ms. Tarsan, and also we are all these last maybe 5 or 6 hours we have been talking about to avoid rezoning. So when it comes to Sienna, why it is any different? I believe, just like you mentioned, we should look into long-term solution. We should look into land, and we're talking about 16,000 homes are going to be built there. So that none of this stuff we are talking is not a long-term solution, in my opinion. So I'm going to have a hard time voting for this motion.
Mr. Rice.
I agree with Mr. George.
Mrs. James.
Well, I'm not suggesting that this is a long-term solution, but I am suggesting that we need to have a short-term solution because we're in a little bit of a crisis right at the moment, I think. And it's hard to say. I agree with the concept of doing some innovative programming, and I definitely would encourage administration to develop that. And I will look forward to hearing, as Dr. Dupree said, before they can really put something together, it's going to be the fall. But I think we have to start considering what we're going to do in the short term while we're getting the innovative programming option put together. So I feel like this needs to be the attendance boundary changes need to be available as a tool to help us get through the next 4 to 5 years until we can either we found some land and we're ready to go forward in the next bond and build another school, or we have developed an awesome innovative program that we're going to implement at Ridgepoint, and it's going to take care of the problem. I'd be willing to add to my motion something about innovative programming or...
So I was going to make an amendment.
Go for it.
I was going to make an amendment to include in this motion the innovative programming or flexible scheduling option to be studied and to have an implementation plan and to show us what rezoning would look like based on that plan. Do I have a second? All right, we have a motion by Ms. Tossan, and that's the first motion I've made in 2 years, and a second by Ms. Helliger. Do we have discussion on this amendment?
Could you please?
Yeah, I need you to turn your mic on.
Can I get a clarity on that motion you just made?
I asked for them to bring to us an implementation plan for flexible scheduling at Ridge Point and to show us what rezoning would look like as they phase in and implement that plan so that we can see the impact it will have on reducing the number of kids that have to be moved.
Okay, so we are not practically voting on rezoning, but we are.
Well, we're going to in a minute. This motion is to amend the original. This is to amend the original motion and add the flexible scheduling piece. Ms. Helliger.
I have a question though. I think based on your explanation, I think you have to change the motion altogether, because if you're saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying for the admins to bring back a recommendation of what zoning would look like and bring back a recommendation of flexible spending without rezoning, right?
No, what I just said, I'm amending the original motion to include flexible scheduling, implementation plan, and how that implementation plan would impact rezoning in the future. How it would impact what kids at Ridge Point would be rezoned. So I'm amending the original motion to include that piece.
But I guess, wouldn't they have to do that anyways? They would have to come back to us with a plan on what they were going to do for rezoning? If we vote to rezone the original motion?
So I think that you are running into some competing charges to the administration, because the original motion called for the rezoning of these two relevant schools. And the amendment is really calling for the administration to come back and provide a plan for rezoning along with implementation of some other programs that they might initiate at the school. So
Okay.
Given what you said, though, going back to the original motion, just as a point of clarification, really all the board could do with the original motion is conceptually say it's in support of rezoning, because you don't have a rezoning plan with boundaries to consider and approve tonight.
That's why I thought it could be an amendment, because we are only saying that we conceptually support rezoning because we have to do something in the short term. And I am adding to that I want them to also bring me an implementation plan for flexible scheduling and the impact that would have on rezoning.
So
I don't think they compete. I think they...
Well, as you stated it that way, I don't think that they compete, because what I hear you saying is rather than the board charge the administration with effectuating the rezoning, you're charging the administration to come back with a rezoning plan as well as...
Well, they can't come back with a rezoning plan because that has to be made with the engagement of the community. So we are saying conceptually that if the motion as amended passes, we would be saying that we conceptually support rezoning to address the short-term problems, and that they will also be bringing us a plan for implementation of flexible scheduling and the impact that might have on the number of students that need to be rezoned.
So I hear that, but at some point, the boundaries will have to be approved by the board.
Right, but that's a secondary. That's later. That's separate. So we have a motion to amend on the table. Do we have additional discussion? Mr. Rosenthal.
You had brought up the purchase of land. Do you want to include that, or is that a separate?
I was going to do it separately.
Okay, doesn't really matter, but.
Doesn't really matter.
Okay.
Do we have additional discussion? Okay, we're voting on the amendment. Motion passes. Okay, so now we're voting on the underlying motion, which is that we conceptually support rezoning in that area, and we are asking the administration to also bring to us an implementation plan for flexible scheduling and the impact it's going to have on the students that would need to be rezoned. Do we have discussion on that motion? Okay, hearing none, please vote. Motion passes. All right, I'd like to make an additional motion that we include in the bond money for purchase of land for a future high school in the Sienna area.
Second.
We have a motion by Mrs. Tassan and a second by Mr. Rice. Do we have discussion? All right, hearing none, please vote. Motion passes. Okay, praise God. Right. Recommendation 10. This is another one of the recommendations that have the innovative programming included in it. Am I to understand that the board would like for the administration to bring us additional information on the programming to be implemented in Hightower, Marshall, and Willow Ridge?
Yeah.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I agree with that. So we've addressed innovative programming for elementary schools in the Marshall and Willow Ridge feeder pattern. This touches on high schools, but we have not mentioned middle schools. So not that I want to bite off more than we can chew, but I just wonder if there's some innovative programming that needs to be considered at the middle school level. So I'd like to throw that out there as a suggestion.
Do we have additional discussion? Okay. Okay. And we have recommendation 11, which is to construct the new middle school to serve the Hightower High School and Ridge Point High School feeder patterns. May I have a motion?
Madam President, I move to approve that action.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. Rice and a second by Mr. Rosenthal. Do we have discussion on this? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes. We did it, guys. 1:20 a.m. So, before we go on, I want to again thank the steering committee members for your service, and especially those who stayed here so late and watched this vote, and to all the committee members, the community members for being here as well. I think this might be one of the latest board meetings we've ever had. Okay, we're now moving on to the consent agenda. I'm going to remove from that agenda item 14A, 2, 3, and 4. May I have a motion?
Madam President, I move to approve the consent agenda in its entirety with the exception of 14A, 2, 3, and 4.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. Rice and a second by Mr. George. Do we have discussion on consent agenda items? Mrs. James.
Yes, I just want to point out to the board, Mr. Rosenthal and I, as members of the policy committee, met with administration regarding CV local, and there'll be a new series of reports that'll be coming to the board. And I actually, now I can't explain it because I'm too foggy, but anyway, there's something new that's happening. Dr. Dupree, do you remember what it is?
Well, I was going to propose that we do a board update item that kind of outlines the new reporting structure in support of CV local. kind of, that way we can put some references that the board can follow.
Any other discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes. May I have a motion for 14A, 2, 3, and 4?
Madam President, I move to approve consent agenda item 14A, 2. Did you want them all in one motion?
Yes,
2,
sir.
3, and 4, as presented.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. Rice and a second by Mr. George. I'm going to take discussion in a moment, but I'm going to read for the record that a meeting of the Board of Trustees is called for 5:30 p.m. on June 4th, 2018. June 11th, so it's not written correctly. Scratch that. At 5:30 p.m. on June 11th, 2018, at the Fort Bend ISD Administration Building Boardroom for the purpose of discussion and possible adoption of the 2018-19 budget and tax rate. Do we have additional discussion? Hearing none, please vote. Motion passes. All right, we have future agenda items. Dr. Dupree,
Can you read it?
we can read it. Can we read it? All right, we're now going to convene in closed session under the Texas Open Meetings Act, Section 551.074, to discuss selection of board officers for 2018-19. We are now convened in closed session. We'll be right back.